Hi, this is Paul. Now that I'm back and sort of settled in, there's some things that came up over the summer that I want to take some time to deal with. It was difficult to take time over the summer to deal with these things given my travel schedule and my this is YouTubing is not my primary job. My primary job is being a pastor of Living Stones, and so YouTubing sort of comes second. Now, this summer, I did a lot of estuary work, and as some of you complained, the channel wasn't terribly flush with new content this summer, and I told you going into it that was the case. But Nathan had made quite a bit of a certain amount of noise complaining about myself, especially not addressing some of his concerns and some of his critiques. And so I was delighted to see that he did a video with John Vervaeke, and it's very much a worthwhile video to watch. And I think I think John was actually the right person to address a lot of Nathan's critiques. And then, well, let's just jump into it, and I'll have a few things to say about some of this. But I think John, I pretty much, I'm very satisfied with the way John handled things in this video.
So there's sort of a unique set of spaces that kind of intersect, I suppose, around you. And some of the people, most of my audience will be familiar with people like Paul van der Klee. I've had a number of conversations with him.
Yeah.
And Jordan Peterson, I do, obviously, because he's fairly famous now, and I do quite a lot of videos about him, so my audience will. And you're sort of in those spaces, and Jonathan Pageau as well. But I suppose even though you're kind of broadly, I don't know if you would self-identify as being kind of like an intellectual dark web type thinker or something like that. You can tell me if you self-identify that way. I don't know.
No,
but
I don't.
I won't put that label on you then. But I'd say so.
And I think that's helpful to know, because John very much doesn't identify that way. Jonathan very much doesn't identify that way. David Fuller called me the pastor of the intellectual dark web, and so I sort of chuckle when I say that. But I think John, I think, has some critiques of the movement, especially because the movement became really wrapped up in the culture war in a way that John has very clearly distinguished himself from. John does not get into culture war issues very overtly. I don't know how much of Awakening from the Meaning Crisis Nathan had watched prior to this, but I think a good going through Awakening from the Meaning Crisis, even though it's a big assignment, it's 51-hour videos, I get that, but if you really want to get a sense of John Vervaeke and the project that he's on, the videos are out there. A lot of it's a matter of doing the homework. And so even though John was a colleague with Jordan and has known him for years, and Jonathan Pageau is a personal friend with Jordan and has known him for years, and both of them continue to collaborate with Jordan on a variety of projects, the truth is that when it comes especially to, let's say, culture war politics, John, Jonathan, and myself are all really quite distinct from each other, and in many ways from Jordan. Part of what makes this, what we call this little corner, and somebody on the last video said, Paul says that in about every video. Yeah, it's because we don't have another name for it, and I didn't come up with the name. Sevilla King came up with the name, but that's the name we're using because it's the only name we have right now. But this little corner has never been about politics or political agreement. This little corner has not even been about social agreement. If we were to talk about, let's say, how we stand on social practices, myself and Jonathan and John, you would find three different positions on whole ranges of things. It's also true that amongst the four of us, if we're going to include Jordan Peterson, I'm the only American. The other three are Canadians, and Nathan is from the UK. And so when it comes, because American politics tends to be this maw that sort of sucks everything in, I'm the only one that votes in American elections. And, plenty of people around my channel have plenty of thoughts about the way I conduct myself with respect to politics. And the truth is, there you have it. So, yeah, none of us so much in the IDW, except perhaps me, just because David Fuller sort of brought me in a joke as the pastor of the IDW.
So some of your ideas are sort of appealing to people who are in those communities. Maybe you'd accept that much. And I suppose from my point of view, I'm kind of the caricature boogeyman of that, because I'm like a reductive naturalist and a postmodernist and all these horrible things that mean that my life is meaningless and that I kill babies and eat them and stuff like that. So I thought this conversation could be interesting because just from the point of view of I'm someone who kind of adopts, I suppose, very different positions to yourself, but I also sort of think that I do understand a lot of your ideas. And I guess I've not seen a lot of conversations with people who really take the opposite position to yourself. I've seen lots of conversations with people who sort of are broadly accepting of lots of these ideas, but maybe, I don't know if you wanted to just comment on my initial thoughts there, maybe. I know it's not much of a question, but just to give you some space.
I think it's fair. In some ways, I think you're right. But in other ways, I find that I'm often talking across significant divides. I'm talking to people who are committed Christians, and I'm not. Or I'm talking to people who are Jews or Muslims, and I'm not. Even talking to Buddhists, and I don't identify that way. So I often am getting pushback from people having sort of established worldviews that I want to challenge. Do I get about broadly challenges around some of, I guess, the cognitive scientific things I'm saying? Not so much on the YouTube, but of course I get it in my professional work. I get it. I mean, I have to go through the peer review process. I have to present at conferences. I just came back from one and take the difficult questions. So that's a bit of a disjunct for me. There's a bit of a difference between the interactions I have in what you might call my professional world and the interactions I have on YouTube. But part of that is also I'm trying to do a lot of experimentation with this medium, and I'm trying to get out. I'm not precluding anything we want to engage into here, but I'm trying to get out of the sort of people yelling at each other and endless debate that is chewing up YouTube, and as far as I can see, to no good purpose. So
entertaining. I think yes.
And I think right there is noting some people find it entertaining. This point that he makes about that Jonathan and I and Jordan does a lot of talking with reductive materialists. He's had significant conversations with Sam Harris. He's had significant conversations with Steven Pinker. He regularly talks to people who are reductive materialists. And there's an aspect of Jordan Peterson that remains a reductive materialist. John himself is a physicalist. John's very clear about that in many of his videos and many of his conversations. But probably one thing that Jonathan, Jordan, and I all have in common is that we see a lot of the debate type new atheists versus God people. We've seen a lot of these kinds of videos, and we don't think it's going anywhere. And so part of what the three of us try to do when we get together is we try to have productive conversations across different lines. And we try to have clarity and charity, and we're not really looking so much to entertain people with the blood sport of winning online battles that seem to go round and round and go nowhere. And I think if you want an example of that, look at my conversation with Vaush. Somebody set that up a number of years ago, and Vaush and I had a perfectly lovely conversation. It didn't sort of reduce down into these debates where there's a winner and a loser, because I think all of us feel there's not a lot of winning that goes on in that. It's just not a terribly fun or productive game.
Entertaining, and it helps sell products, and it helps keep corporate capitalism going, and all those wonderful things. But I'm also interested in Can this medium serve to give people the kinds of connections that they're hungry for and seeking for? And
Right.
so that's a bit of a difference. But I'm happy.
It's also the case that the differences between John, Jonathan, and myself are significant. There are significant differences between an Orthodox icon carver and a Christian Reformed minister. There are significant differences between a non-theist cognitive scientist and two people who have crunchy Christian faith. Now, the overall criticism that we're not spending enough time with reductive materialists, I think, is, as John noted rightly, we live amidst reductive materialists all the time. I just had to open the doors for a Nigerian Anglican church that is using our facility. It would sort of be like criticizing them for not engaging American culture. And I think a lot of those immigrants would say, I live in American culture. I engage American culture all the time. It'd be sort of like telling African Americans that they're avoiding white people. And they would look at them and say, I'm living in the midst of a very white society, thank you. And so, I enjoy having conversations with secular materialists on issues of faith. I just don't think that the old model of this apologetics debate really goes anywhere.
Also, to have a good faith discussion with somebody who disagrees with me significantly. Like I say, that's a mainstay for me within my academic world.
Yeah, I think we sort of agree in goals there, because I certainly find myself with a lot of people who have deconverted, sort of congregating around my channel, and there's a bit of a community of people who regularly come back, and maybe there's even a sense of people sort of processing a kind of trauma, like, how did I give so many years of my life?
Now, what he's talking about here, you should sort of stick a pin in it, in sort of Sam Harris way of talking. You should sort of stick a pin in this. And there's a freedom that they're enjoying of people who have sort of left the church and are deconstructed, in whatever language you want to use. And there's an enjoyment of being together. And I'm not saying they should stop. John's not saying they should stop. Jonathan's not saying they should stop. Part of the American Constitution is freedom of association. And I would say you should continue to have conversations amongst yourselves. Now, part of what sort of seems to arise later with Nathan in this conversation, but also with some people in my channel, is there's this sort of this overbearing motherly fear of unsupervised people doing things on their own that I'm afraid this will go badly. And this, again, is a critique I often get of Estuary. What if Christians don't win? The big point of a lot of our conversations is that the conversations are not about winning, because that framework of winning, we believe, is counterproductive to the larger and more important aspects of conversation that have to do with community building and truth seeking together.
To this thing, or how do I just unable to kind of leave this thing behind in the past, and so that if being able to have a community where you can joke about it or look at the apologetics and stuff and go, it gives you that a bit of that meaning and community, maybe that.
Again, remember what he's saying right here, because that's going to be important a little bit later on in this video.
Yeah,
that religion used to provide.
Yeah, I think so. And I mean, I'm speaking from my own experience, coming out of that, the deconversion process, and it's probably also a factor that I was taught for a long time as a kid. But it took me a long time, and I see it taking a lot of people a long time. They go through sort of different stages, and so I have a lot of sympathy with people that are coming out of a religious framework and struggling to find a reorientation on the world that makes sense for them and makes sense with others for them.
So I'm hoping that my interview isn't going to come across.
And quite frankly, and I know this bothers some Christians, but that's also a function of, for some people, what happens in Estuary and what some people, why some people watch my channel. Some people are, in fact, moving towards faith, and some people are moving away from it. And I know now I'm talking more to Christians. A lot of people, or some Christians, have criticized me because they look at this and say, well, are you facilitating people leaving the faith? And I would say, look, pastorally, it looks like this. What often happens in churches is that people are deconstructing or deconverting quietly, sort of out in the background, and the pastor doesn't know it because they're avoiding the pastor. They don't want to talk to the pastor. They're staying away from these issues, and they're just sort of doing it with other like-minded people or doing it on themselves. And then suddenly they're outside the church realm, and they've done all of this processing completely apart from the church. And pastorally, I would far rather have someone come to me and say, Pastor, I've got a lot of doubt. I'm wondering if I'm still going to be a Christian. I'm wondering if I want this or not. And I would say, let's talk about it. And I wouldn't say, I'm going to talk about it so I can keep you in the fold. It certainly is a motivation in my mind, but it's not within my power to give them faith or take away their faith. It's a little bit more probably to take away their faith if you look at passages about millstones and the bottom of the sea. But as a pastor, I want to be in on those conversations. I want to be there in the room. I want to have a part of that. And anybody who's watched me at any length in this channel knows I don't think it helps for pastors to be sort of mercenary headhunters in conversations like that. They need to be helpful for people going in or going out, but hopefully helpful to say, have you considered this? Have you considered that? And I don't think I'm alone pastorally in this sense. I watched my father do that for years. Because that's what pastoral care is, care of the soul. And often what happens with people is that they might deconstruct out of one particular aspect or area or evolution of their faith, and they might be for a while outside the church only to come back later with a better, more robust, stronger, more real faith. And as a pastor, my job is to help them move closer to faith and truth in Christ. And so this is part of the reason that I am not overly bothered by the idea that some people are going to listen to Jordan Peterson or be involved in an estuary or listen to my channel and stop going to church. I don't think they're going to get initiated into that by what I'm doing, but I certainly want to at least have a seat at the table as they work their processes. Or processes in Canada.
Cross is sort of too negative, but I do have like a number of criticisms of things that you said from my point of view.
Sure.
And I hope you can see that I'm asking these things because, I genuinely disagree, and I'm not just trying to make you like, I'm not trying to like do a gotcha thing or like be complicated or anything like that.
That's fine. As long as as long as it's coming in good faith, I'm happy to talk.
Cool. So I think the first question that I have is sort of from your work and sort of circles around you, people like Paul van der Kley, a lot of people seem to adopt kind of idiosyncratic uses of language, right? So terms like dialogos or relevance realization, things like that. And I personally have struggled with people using these terms because
this has been a big part of Nathan's criticism, and he's brought this to me a number of times. And I think John, partly because John, part of what all of us have done, at least between the three of us, and if we include Jordan, the four of us, we've all had different roles to play in this. And part of what John has done, and we've talked about this quite a bit, is offered a vocabulary that many of us are finding helpful. Now, I remember when I first started engaging John's work, I got a lot of pushback from Christians. Buddhism and cognitive science, and there's a lot of Christians sort of boundary policing with respect to Buddhism. And, why are you talking to him? And for the most part, over the last 2-3 years, a lot of those people that started out telling me I shouldn't engage John's work, or I shouldn't talk to John, or I shouldn't do any of this, a lot of those people have come to really value John's work. And this is exactly the kind of dynamic we're looking for. This is exactly the kind of dynamic that we're seeking, where we, despite our differences, can have good faith conversations that people find helpful, whether or not in the moment they are crossing one of the boundary lines from one of the different silos or camps into the other.
Because I guess I don't see them doing that much more than the sort of English cognate that we already have, like dialogue, or with maybe with relevance realization, it's like maybe like just focus or paying attention to something like that, right? To something. I mean, maybe.
And anybody who knows John knows that it's almost like filing cabinets are going up in his head, because John's got all of this stuff. And I think what John does here, in terms of over the last few years, I've really seen John grow in his ability. And I think it's because of YouTube and because of these interactions and because of all of these conversations. He's figured out how to take a lot of these complex ideas that he arrived at in the academy and has written peer-reviewed papers on them in scientific journals, but now he's able to sort of capsulate them in small ways. And I think, part of it is, I assume, that I'm much more familiar with understanding them, because they're not necessarily easy to understand, but I think John's gotten a lot better at explaining them.
Maybe you would dispute that if you're using it in like a more technical sense, but those are the ways I broadly see these terms being used. And then I see them, because it sounds like you're kind of speaking in a classical language or something, that a lot of people in these communities, from my point of view then, sort of think that they're saying something quite profound because they're using like a technical sounding term, but they're actually just saying like an ordinary English sentence, like I want to have, when they're like, oh yeah, because we want to have dialogos. From my point of view, they're saying like, well, we just want to have conversations, but it's like, but from their point of view, they
now this has been a significant part of Nathan's criticism, and on Twitter and on YouTube, Nathan has used words like the exhausting nonsense that is PVK's Christian pseudo-profound drivel. And a lot of it has been this criticism that, well, people around are using these words to sort of sound important or feel pseudo-scientific or pseudo-profound or something of this nature. And again, I think John takes on all of these aspects and really speaks very clearly. And that now it might very well be that a number of us are continuing to try to get up to speed with John's language and are perhaps not using his words with the technical precision that John is. I'm sure that's the case, because in many ways, John's work, especially for those of us who are not in the academy, and we are not cognitive scientists, and we don't have all the erudition or education that John has, we're probably sort of like children growing into this language. But the charge against it is that this language is pseudoscientific drivel that is leading people astray. That's the anxiety that I continue to hear from Nathan, and he's in fact going to articulate this more fully a little bit later in the video.
I think they've sort of like said something more, and I think that this almost functions like a like an in-group, out-group marker if you've adopted the language versus if you haven't. And
now I think that is true. It does function as an in-group, out-group marker, but that tends to be inevitable, and there are many such aspects of that theologically. Churches are full of in-group, out-group language. The academy is full of in-group, out-group language. In fact, I think a lot of Nathan's criticism of what's been going on in this little corner of the internet involves in-group, out-group language, because he continues to say that you're not dealing with this stuff philosophically. And my response to that is, I'm a pastor. I'm not trying to.
But I don't know that it's actually like doing any work in terms of helping people figure something out who are then in the in-group rather than...
Okay, so it's not helping the people. He's worried, he's anxious about people on the in-group, that it's not helping them. Well, appreciate your generosity of spirit, appreciate your concern. is it the case? Well, and part of me would say, well, I think, for the most part, most of our audience is 25 to 40 and on up there. And we appreciate your concern, but we're grown adults, and I think we're allowed to use language.
And just providing like a social function of delineating who's on the in-group and who's in the...
Now, remember when I said to stick that pin in something earlier about the social function? Before, he's talking about what he does on his channel as having a valuable social function for people who are deconverting from Christianity. It's important they have their community. It's important they have together. I bet they have their in-group words. In fact, I know they do. So that social function is okay, but now he is worried about, now notice this anxiety again. I pointed it out earlier. This is what you see as a recurring pattern. It's sort of this anxious mothering that there's this little corner of the internet, and they're using these in-group words, and maybe they're using them wrong. Someone should come in there and fix them. Really? These are adults here.
The out group. And I wondered what your response to that would be.
Sure.
Just because obviously I think you've coined some of these words, and so you perhaps think there's something more going on.
Yeah, well, let's do the easier of the two. I mean, relevance realization is an actual published theory about trying to solve a particular problem in the explanation of intelligence, which is how, and it's not captured by a word like focus or attention because it deals with the very specific problem of how do you get a system to zero in on the relevant information, ignore the irrelevant information without checking all that information and determining that it's irrelevant. And so I think that the reason why people might be seeming to use it the way you're saying, the relevance realization, is, I can't control the degree to which people have paid attention to the extensive explanation of relevance realization, and I keep publishing on it. I published in the Journal of Phenomenology and Cognitive Science two articles this year on relevance realization theory, integrating it with predictive processing, for example. So I think it's a bona fide theory, and therefore using it is meant to be an explanatory use. It's trying to explain a central function.
Now, it's important here to notice that you have the department head of cognitive science of University of Toronto explaining to someone who is not a scientist, who does not have a PhD in cognitive science, about basically this term that has become a term within cognitive science, within that discipline, that he has published at a high level, basically to someone who has worked in computer programming, is considering to getting an advanced degree in philosophy, but doesn't know cognitive science. It's sort of like someone coming to me and saying, these weird words that you use, like transubstantiation or dispensationalism or supralapsarianism. I hear some people using those words out there, and they might not be using them correctly. And my response would be, how much do you understand about transubstantiation, dispensationalism, or supralapsarianism? These are sort of technical words in a certain community, but
of cognition, and link that functionality to particular phenomenology, like the notion of the way salience is playing out, the connections between attention and salience that are not intuitively obvious when you use words like focus. Even the notion of focus is, using a spotlight model of attention, focusing a beam of light that is, actually misleading in powerful ways. And I go into that in the series. And so I'm trying to get people to understand attention, understand salience, and understand intelligence with this notion. So I think that is how I respond to the relevance realization. The dialogos is I'm trying to put my finger on these practices that I've engaged in, like circling, like empathy circling, like Buddhist dialogue, in which people are creating a different set of guideposts and normative structures for how the conversation will unfold, because what they're trying to do is not just converse, not just share information, but they're trying to engage in generating something like a mutual flow state that often puts them into an ability to understand themselves and other people in a more profound way, just like the flow state within, playing a game of hockey will put you into optimal performance, or getting into the flow state while you're in martial arts is conducive to optimal performance. And I'm trying to understand what are the conditions and the constraints, both within and without, that bring that about, and why people are, like, as far as I can tell, independently all around the world creating these communities. Why are they so central? What are they doing in them that seems to matter? And what seems to matter is this ability to, within that shared flow state, to get ways of having insight about themselves, their social and emotional relationships to other people, and even their relationship to the world at large. And so I do not think that is conveyed by the word dialogue. And that is what I'm trying to convey with the notion of dialogos. And I'm generating a whole new series around it called After Socrates, to try and articulate what exactly that process looks like.
And so basically what John is doing is essentially what we often do when we want to talk about something, but we want to take the meaning that is sort of close to something else, but a little bit different. And so language has that flexibility. And so if you use that other term, and again, there is an insider and an outsider aspect to that. If you say dialogos to someone who's not been around this little corner of the internet, well, they're not going to know what you mean. And this, again, if you go back to the Thunder Bay conversations, this is an issue that I have brought up. I brought it up on stage when we had the 4 speakers with Richard Mondrell, John Vervaeke, Jonathan Pageau, and myself, when we start sort of nerding out in our little intramural things to continue to remind, we can use these words, but we're going to have to use them carefully. And again, we're going to have to pay attention to insider and outsider things. This is something I'm very accustomed to in church. I'm very accustomed to in church planting especially, and we often talk about it with respect to Christianese. What do I mean by that? Christianese is not a word, but if I say he's speaking Christianese, you all know what I mean, because I'm taking an established word and I'm tweaking it a little bit to add another understanding to it. It's not an illegitimate use of language. It's an important use of language. It has to be used with care, but it is very legitimate, especially when you have sort of a community that is working on something, and that mutual working together will develop new language. For example, I've taken some of John's ideas, such as the agent-arena relationship, and I've used that with respect to my God number 1 and God number 2, and talked about the agentic God and the arenic God. And what happens when you do the kind of work that we're doing in this little corner of the internet, you will tend to derive new terms, and these will be in-house terms. And those are important for the community to sort of have shortcuts with each other. There will be difficult for those outside the community. And yes, there will be social dynamics where some people, when they use Christianese, I just had it in the church in my sanctuary a few minutes ago, what Christians do in a social situation when they use these words that are sort of insider words is they reinforce bonds with each other. They reinforce community with each other, which is an important function of those words within the community. It's important in terms of keeping the bonds together. I've watched Democrats do this with each other. I've watched Republicans do this with each other. I see Christians do this with each other. This is a normal and, in fact, healthy form of using a language and, in fact, growing a language.
Yeah, so maybe just on the first point, because I don't want to talk about too much all at once, I suppose, would be, so recently, I don't know how recently it was recorded, but recently released was your interview with Lex Friedman, right? And when you introduced relevance realization with him, and in many other places, and people who kind of follow your work, like Paul van der Klay, repeat this as well. So people will mention like there's a problem of combinatorial explosion, for example,
Sure.
right?
Yes, yeah.
And I guess I kind of take issue with this so I understand if someone talks about combinatorial explosion in terms of analyzing algorithmic asymptotic complexity or something, right? Like, but I've not actually seen a particular algorithm or problem being introduced that is n factorial, big O n factorial, right? And I don't even know what.
Now, this is an area that Nathan has some competence in, I assume, because again, his degree is in computer science and programming. And so he has a degree of math competency. And so now he's using within the sphere of mathematics to try to say, okay, you're talking about this combinatorial explosiveness. I'm not sure this works in my little math coven. And I'll let Bethel deal with that aspect of it if she wants to.
And is here in this case. So the idea of there being something that is combinatorially explosive is that you've got this this function that's growing, as a n factorial rate, and I don't even know what n is in that case. And I think that there's almost like a metaphor being made to something using language that sounds sort of mathematical and computational. And maybe I'm wrong, and this is just because I've not engaged with the academic literature on the subject and just engaged with like the popular stuff. But it seems like a lot of people are using this word to make it sound like they're saying something scientific, but actually all they're saying is like there's a lot.
Okay, sound like they're saying scientific. It's not. I don't think you should blame the churches of the world for this bias that we have towards science and truth. A lot of people want to make things sound scientific, and we see this all over the society, and that's because what has developed in our society is this whole idea about science. Follow the science, they tell us, with respect to how many sorts of things, and often real scientists will stop and say, there's nothing scientific about all this science-y language out there in the world. And so Nathan's critique is that, we're using this to sound science-y. I'm not really using this to sound science-y at all. Sounding science-y is not my bag.
A lot of ways of looking at something, but the actual use of combinatorial explosion there is like mathematically incorrect, because there isn't something that's, they might mean maybe there's like a very large number or an infinite number of different ways you could look at something, but there isn't actually something that grows n factorial, right? And I guess I just take I have a problem with that, because I'm like, why is that very precise, specific piece of mathematical terminology being used? If it.
So he's the guardian of mathy sounding stuff.
Isn't doing that. So maybe it is in the technical literature, and you can address that concern.
Yeah. So the term was imported into psychology by Holyoake when he was explaining the work that was taken up by Simon, Newell and Simon, when he was doing a problem solving, and he was giving a standard example, which you may have seen me do, about a search space, and this is how Newell and Simon analyzed problem solving, in which you have your initial state, your goal state, and then you have all the various options opening up. And he gave the example of a chess game, and where you can calculate the number of alternative pathways you have to seek as f to the d, where f is the number of average moves on any turn and d is the number of turns, and it's 30 to the power of 60, which is larger than the number of atomic particles in the universe. And that's when he used the term combinatorially explosive for that. And that's how it was used within the problem solving literature, because the idea is any attempt to solve that with finite processing like we have is going to doom you to failure. You can't do any kind of exhaustive search. So the question becomes, how do you select the pathways? Because you don't have a bird's eye view. How do you zero in on them without checking to see if they're going to lead to your goal state or not? And so this brought up the whole notion of bounded rationality by people like Simon and Newell. And so the notion of the combinatorially explosive search space is exactly that notion. I've never, ever said it was infinite. When people do that, I try to correct them and say sort of indefinitely large, things like that. But that's the problem I'm pointing to. And this is still one of the central problems in AGI. How to avoid, and you can't do an algorithmic search.
AGI is artificial general intelligence.
Because most algorithmic searches are going to commit you to a combinatorially explosive search. You're just going to be searching forever. And you can't do an arbitrary search. So the issue is, how do you get intelligent behavior that's between the arbitrary and the algorithmic? That's what I'm pointing to with relevance realization.
And I've used it, and Jonathan has used it, and Jordan Peterson has used it, and John is right, because this is one thing that is not necessarily obvious to us. And this, in fact, was a lot of what Jordan worked on in his first talk with Sam Harris in Vancouver, that, in fact, we have all of these filters in us that are pre-conscious, that we're not aware of them at all. But we're constantly sorting out the world because the world has too many things and many different kinds of things for us to manage. And that's what we often talk about in terms of combinatorial explosive. When I walk in my office, even my little messy office has too many things for me to focus on. And so when I walk in my office, I focus on things that are salient to me. And I've been talking about communal or communal relevance realization, because part of what happens, let's say the whole problem of politics right now, that there are way too many political facts for me to ever learn or discover to have time for in my life. I'm not saying there are infinite political facts, but John said it perfectly. There are an indeterminate number of political facts, and that number is too much for me to wade through. And so what we do as a collective, with collective relevance realization, is we deal with the fact that we follow other guides through it. And in fact, as children, this is exactly part of what we learned. We learned from our parents what to pay attention to. Part of the struggle of autism, it seems, is that people are struggling to reduce the world in a way that everyone else is doing the reduction. I've had a fair amount of experience with schizophrenics in my work. And schizophrenia, too, seems to be a problem in some way of communal selection. And, to sort of just dismiss all of this as gibberish, okay, you can do that, but it isn't gibberish to me. And I think it's, in fact, not only observable, but demonstrative and demonstrable to do, which is exactly, I think, what John has been doing. And this, again, in terms of the three of us doing different things, in terms of our tiny little community relating to one another, John has brought in a realm of really helpful language, information, knowledge. I didn't know all of this stuff, and I watched Awakening from the Meaning Crisis, and you sit and you think about it, and at first it's sort of hard to understand, but after some time you begin to realize, my goodness, he's right. And it doesn't even stop where he is. And then once you sort of see the concept and see the reality of it, you begin to recognize this all over the place. I recognize it in terms of how Christians read the Bible. I recognize it in terms of the history of interpretation. You see this dynamic, this pattern, and you begin to recognize that there's a tremendous amount of pre-filtering that goes on that somehow we build into ourselves, and then we practice as relevance realization. We do this as individuals, and we do it as communities. We do it as a body politic. We do it as a whole number of things. And this, again, is, I think, part of the reason why a number of us are tremendously excited about John's work and about the fact that he has taken this work that probably would be in scientific journals, and now he has brought it out into broader spaces where a Reformed minister and where an Orthodox icon carver can now benefit from this, see relationships in this work with our own areas of work, and then be able to compare notes. And I think that's part of the reason all of us see this as, what an amazing gift. But it's not something that's immediately apparent. And it takes effort, it takes time, and it takes work to watch 50 hours of Awakening from the Meaning Crisis. and listen to the conversations and begin to understand that, okay, you might not like combinatorial explosiveness because it sounds too mathy. You could call it overwhelming complexity. You could have all sorts of different names for it. The difficulty is, once you have a group of people that is sort of working together, working on something, they need a common language. And there will be an in-group, out-group aspect to that language, but they need that language in order to actually make progress together. And John is the one who has furnished some of that language. Now, does a reformed minister or an icon carver sometimes use this language in ways that wouldn't be used in the Cognitive Science Academy? I'm sure it happens all the time. But that's the risk that you take when you decide to talk to people outside your discipline.
Now, I'm hoping that that's what people are pointing to when they use the phrase, because if that's what they're pointing to something real, and it's central to the question of the nature of intelligence.
I guess maybe to make the question more specific, I understand how that applies in modeling an algorithm for playing chess, but sure. I don't understand the bridge between the chess case and the case of my perception. So what the individual bits are mapping to. I mean, like what is the algorithm in the case of?
You've picked out people to talk to from this little corner of the internet. Why aren't you seeking out Elon Musk? Why aren't you annoyed by, well, actually, I was watching him on Twitter and he's annoyed by something else and he was going after that. Where's the filter? You can't engage everything. Some things are more salient than others. This dynamic that John points out, in fact, runs rough through everything that we do because, as John and Jordan and Jonathan have all noted, to live is to select. And the question is, why are we making the selections we're making? Why are we talking to this person and not that person? Why are we interested in this thing and not that thing? It's in fact pre-conscious for us, but once you begin to understand this dynamic, you see it all over the place.
Yeah.
So what the idea is, anything you're doing, this is, I guess, the main claim you wanted me to get to. Anything you're doing, any even perceptual act, is an act of problem solving. You are trying to, you're in some, like even in an initial state, and you're trying to look at an object. There's a goal state about trying to look at that object. And there's many different alternative pathways you can engage in. And you could count the number of things you could do in order to move around, reorientation. You could open one eye, close another eye. And so I guess what you're asking is, how do you designate the operators? Well, I mean, that's sort of a question you do when you're reflecting on any problem formulation. That's part of the problem, right? And this is another issue. It's not the same issue as the combinatorial explosion. Many of our problems are ill-defined, and we precisely don't know how to individuate or designate or select or activate the right operator. What is the right way to look at this object? I mean, what does that mean? What are the operations I should bring in? I can focus my attention.
Is this a coaster? Is this a lens cap?
I can widen it. I can move closer. I can move farther away. And so, again, when you try to put that in to a search space, and this is one of the problems, in AI vision and AI categorization, like seeing this as a remote is a terrifically hard problem. It's a very, very hard problem. And
we say, well, it's not hard for me. Well, that's because you grew up watching people use it as a remote, or it was introduced to you, like me, a little bit later in life when I was always going up to the TV to work the knob, and now suddenly someone's sitting back there going like this. It's like, oh, well, that's special.
Now getting some machines that are getting closer to being able to see this as something and see it in the right way, to use it in the right way. And they're facing this issue that I'm pointing to. They get into these really huge search spaces, multidimensionality, and how degree to which it should be compressed, the degree to which it should be left uncompressed. These are real issues. And so I see them in the vision research. I see them in the categorization research. So I see the problem, that meta problem, as essentially the same. I see that it also in problems around communication, about how the conveyances expand much faster than any of the explicit statements, et cetera, et cetera. Now I go over that, those converging arguments in Awakening from the Meaning Crisis. And I also was in the paper I published with Tim Levelcrop and Blake Richards in 2012. So
John's always got his footnotes.
So I guess I'll leave that point because there are more points I want to move on to given the time. I guess another term that's been used and introduced kind of recently are egregores, and I don't know how the extent to which your kind of like advocacy for these things goes. But do you want to say if you do kind of advocate for these things? Or...
Now, it's helpful to note that this term came up through Rebel Wisdom. And it's a term that John and Jonathan had, I think, a really excellent conversation on. And what's interesting is one might say, well, why would this be salient to you? We're not encroaching on any mathy space here or any philosophical space. Now we're dealing really with an enlightenment issue.
Or if it's just an idea you think.
So that's problematic for me because, first of all, I misunderstood the term that was being used. I misheard it in one conversation, and I put that in the notes because I've published 3 papers recently with Dan Chiappi talking about the NASA scientists moving the rovers around on Mars. And the basic argument there is there's no one person, there's no one thing that's moving the rover. There's a complex dynamical system of people and the equipment that is actually responsible for navigating the rover. And this is very similar to Hutchins' famous book, Cognition in the Wild, where he made the argument that no one person navigates a ship. It's an entire system of people and the equipment that does the navigation. There's a lot more work going on around this notion, Clark and Chalmers and other people, Gallagher, and, well, like I said, the work that I've published with Dan, arguing that there is a collective intelligence in this kind of distributed cognition. We explicitly argued in the most recent paper we published, again in the Journal of Phenomenology and Cognitive Science, that and other people are arguing for this too, for a notion of we agency, that there's something we can do as a group that is more than the sum of all of our individual action. And
now, here's another pin to stick in this conversation, because this whole concept of we agency is really going to be vital when Nathan gets to what I think is his central anxiety, which will come quite a bit later. So again, the we agency, just remember this spot right here when we get, because it's Nathan's central anxiety, which is sort of the political project anxiety, presumes we agency to do the work that they imagine should be done. But he's skeptical about that we agency in sort of the small enlightenment scientific frame.
Paul, of course, has produced sort of some recent mathematical proofs that is in fact the case. So I'm committed to the idea that there is collective intelligence within distributed cognition, and that there is a kind of we agency attached to that, or that's not the right word, interwoven with that. But I have consistently resisted attributing subjective consciousness or self-awareness to this we agency.
And this is another way that John is such an asset in this little conversation. The precision that he is speaking with and using with respect to these issues is so helpful. And it also shows some of the differences to delineate between John, Jonathan, and myself here.
In fact, at times said that, it's in the literature, it's called zombie agency for that reason. And so to the degree to which we're talking about that, I'm in agreement with people like Jonathan Pageau and Paul van der Klee. Now, Paul and I differ because Paul thinks it's still an open question whether or not.
I do think it's an open question. John is, and John pays attention, and he's got this all really. That's why it's a little scary to talk to John, because sometimes you're talking to him and it's like he knows my argument better than I do. So John's really good at this stuff.
These I don't want to call them egregores, whether or not these...
And in fact, egregores is a term we sort of got stuck with because it's the term that sort of got brought to us from Rebel Wisdom. And it's another good example of this isn't the right term. I would probably rather use spirit. Jonathan Pageau might say angel, but that's, again, we're kind of stuck with the language that we've got on the table.
Distributed cognitive systems are conscious. Now, I've said, and other people have argued this, famously Chalmers and Clark, that the reason why these collectivities don't have consciousness isn't one in principle, because you can't make it one in principle, or then you wouldn't be able to explain how neurons could give rise to consciousness. But it's one of serious practicalities. I talk about, speed, complexity, density, degree of recursion, etc., that don't exist.
And in terms of practicality, this is where, if you go to my conversation with John after our two presentations, I look at it as a pastor much more in terms of, can we recognize consciousness out there? And John, as a cognitive scientist, is paying a lot more attention to the definition of consciousness. And you can hear that come through in our conversation together.
In these entities, these hyper agents, that clearly exist in agents that are uncontroversially conscious, like you or I, or, elephants and chimps. And so I think it is very plausible that we can talk about the intelligent agency of these things, but not attribute to them self-awareness or self-consciousness. Now, when I was talking, just a minute, and I'll let you respond, Nathan. It's a long answer because I'm trying to make a nuanced distinction. When I was talking to Jonathan to this, and I've talked to him recently about it, there was a place in the dialogue where he actually was very open to the conclusion that maybe they don't have self-awareness, they don't have a sense of self, and that they are they're not centers of subjectivity in any sort of standard notion.
And now, also watch what John is doing with his language. I mean, even in this time, he's differentiating and he's using these terms, and those are really helpful differentiations for someone like me who has not thought through all of these aspects of consciousness. Now someone might worry that, well, Paul and John are having conversations and they're unsupervised. And I'd say, well, by what authority ought we to be supervised? Is this really the way we want to conduct ourselves out in the world? That there ought to be a government department of conversational supervision with respect to, well, both John and I, in fact, live under authorities. I am supervised in some ways by my church and by my doctrinal tradition, and that's something I keep in the back of my mind. And I can talk about some of these things with a little bit more liberty than John can, because John similarly is supervised by his peers and by the academy to which he also has submitted and is dependent. So there's a lot going on with this. But part of the beauty of what's developed in this little corner of the internet is that we can do this cross-discipline. And I have the structures of accountability to which I am accountable are very different from the ones that John is accountable to. And what this actually does is creates a unique space between us where, and again, I think his dialogos idea is really helpful, because where I can grow in ways that I'm not impinged on because those aren't my structures of accountability. And this allows me to do some synthesis. And hopefully the same is true for John.
And so I thought that's where we had sort of come to. Have people in the past perhaps thought of these or related to these collective intelligence within distributed cognition using, mythological terms like gods and angels? I mean, that's a Durkheimian thesis. That's a sort of a well-established thesis within anthropology, sociology. I don't think that's an implausible idea. And insofar as Jonathan is talking that people might relate to these things in this mythological fashion, I also find that a plausible premise. That's where the agreement is. Beyond that, I don't agree. And so that's why I'm hesitant to use a certain term. But to be fair to me, I have said all of this in public in these dialogues.
Yeah, so there's a few avenues that I would like to go down with this. Maybe I can put them on the table, and whatever sticks around sticks around for you. So what one question is just in terms of the theory itself, right? Because I can't necessarily say this for yourself, but certainly in terms of Jonathan and Paul, I mean, they talk about these things, this idea, firstly in very unclear terms. So they're not being precise, according to me, in clarifying what they're actually committing themselves to philosophically. So whether they're saying,
I don't know that our primary interest is philosophy, and I mean technical philosophy. So there's one point.
That that there's a kind of like grounding relation or a relation of fundamentality that kind
as a pastor, I'm gonna have to back it up a little bit because I had this thought too. As a pastor, I deal with this all the time. When I sit down with people in church, people talk and they say things. And in the back of my mind, because I'm trained in terms of theological language and the Bible within my tradition and all of these things, there's this little critic in the back of my mind. Shouldn't use that text that way. Shouldn't use that term that way. Shouldn't do this that way. One of the things you learn in time as a pastor is to sort of turn that little voice down a little bit. Because if in the context of this church, I'm always correcting people. Now, this is something that's come up quite often on my channel because I'll have a randos conversation and people will note that, well, this person said this and this and this and this, and you didn't challenge them. This has sort of become a public game because you hear it with journalists and interviews that somehow it's not only the job of the journalist to get the ideas of the person out in as clear a way as possible so the person can present themselves in a way that all of us can sort of understand them and their ideas better. It's somehow also the job of the journalist to police the ethics of the ideas that the person is putting out there. I say no. And part of that in the church is that I'm rather sensitive to when and where and how correction, whether it's biblical, theological, or ethical, happens in the church space. Because one of the things that you learn very quickly is that if you're always the editor, if you're always the arbiter, if you're always the authority, what that does is it impedes people from actually doing the kinds of processing that, remember the first pin? What Nathan talks about in his little community of deconversion? How he finds that so helpful? And how I'm not begrudging them their little community? Instead of being, oh, I want to be a religious authority and I want to storm through the wall, storm through the door of some little deconversion community and then start weighing in. No, I don't want to do that. Why? Because they're human beings and they have certain rights and those rights should be respected. And part of those rights are association and their mind and their thoughts. And so actually, when I'm working even in the church where the stakes are not conversion or deconversion or any of these things, I'm very patient, I'm very gentle, and I try to let people work on their ideas out there. Could I run in and say, that's not reformed, that's not biblical, that's contrary to our tradition? I could, but you know what I don't allow them to do then? I don't allow them to actually begin to get a handle about the language. And so instead, what I'll do is I'll try to ask a question that will be productive. And they'll say it this way. And I'll say, have you thought about this? And what that allows is instead of sort of being the overbearing, supervising taskmaster looking to go in and make everything right. Now, again, this is something that you learn over years of pastoring, because usually when you come out of seminary, that's what people are doing. I was fortunate enough to have a father who was wise, and I learned from him a lot of these tricks. I didn't write it down when he'd do things. I just absorbed it. I just mapped it. But I learned from him very quickly that it's not only an issue whether or not people are correct. It's also an issue in terms of their agency and their desire and their willingness and their community. And so you can run in and sort of chop people down and make sure everything is correct real quick. But what you're going to do is you're going to sacrifice community and agency and growth. And you're also going to sort of give people an idea that we can't talk unless the pastor's here, because the pastor's going to tell us all the special words to say and all the secret things to do. No, I don't want that. I want you to grow into Christ. And what that means is I'm going to be gentle and selective in terms of what I address. And you might say, well, Pastor, how can you justify that from the Bible? And I do it this way. Say, okay, let's presuppose all of what Christianity has to say about Jesus, that he's the Son of God, that he's perfect, that he's all of these things. If you adopt that spirit that I just described of always having to supervise and be on top of everything, is that what Jesus looked like? Can you imagine how busy he would be if every time he saw something wrong, and again, given the delta between our sinfulness and his sinlessness, everything he would see about him would have to be wrong. So what does he practice? You have combinatorial explosiveness of sin all around him. So what does he practice? Wisdom, relevance realization. I'm going to talk about this, and I'm going to talk about this, and I'm going to talk about this. I've only got 3 years of public ministry, but yet his words continue to be interesting and relevant to horizontally cultures around the world and vertically all through time. That's what wisdom is.
Kind of, where there's something that's more fundamental than other things, that is, the egregore or the distributed collective entity or whatever, because it sounds like they want to sort of get that, but then sometimes they sort of retreat from that because to me, at least, it seems like they're sort of scared of making that claim or something. I don't know. And then
maybe we're a little bit afraid of all the secular reductive materialists around who are going to pull out the Enlightenment club and beat us with it.
And then I think if they do make that claim, then that I've never really seen an attempt to actually engage in theory comparison between a theory that postulates, okay, because Jonathan likes to say bottom up and top.
First of all, I don't even know what he means by theory comparison. Now, I'm sure theory comparison has some meaning perhaps in philosophy or mathematics or programming or something, but it's not a term of art within theology.
Bottom up and top down, right? And it's like, okay, well, let's postulate fundamental entities at the top and at the bottom and just compare that to a reductive naturalist theory or something in terms of, can both fit the data? I mean, I think but they're both.
See, and now what you see coming into is this, okay, but this is all, we want to talk to William Lane Craig about this. And I'd say, go talk to William Lane Craig. See, what he's sort of setting up is all of the atheist Christian debates about some of these technical philosophical things. And again, I'm not going to be a conversational fuss budget and say, oh, you can't talk about that. Go ahead. YouTube bandwidth is free and near limitless. I'm just not that interested in it. I'm much more interested in learning from John and learning from Jonathan and learning from Jordan and trying to figure out how we can talk about these things.
There are types of theories that can both fit the data. What type of entities are being postulated, how many different kinds and things like that. And I think that's where the actual discussion is to be had in theory choice, right? Is in actually fleshing out those.
And I'm happy if people want to go around and have their discussion in theory choice. You don't have to invite me.
I don't really see that happening. I just see this a kind of loose talk, right, about how there are these things, that's a given, and therefore anyone who's a materialist is just some dogmatic weirdo who thinks the world's made up.
Well, now we're a little defensive.
Of billiard balls hitting each other or something, and that's sort of what I hear and get very triggered by. Feel free to.
Sure, I think that's reasonable too. There have been multiple points where I've pushed back against it. Even calling it materialism is kind of a misnomer. I think physicalism is a better term for a lot of important reasons, but we can put that aside. I get your point, and it was recorded, so it will show up in public. So I'm not doing a palming darkness thing. At one point, I directly asked both Paul and Jonathan at the conference in Thunder Bay, could these entities exist independently of human beings? Right? Because you can't have it both ways. My answer to that is a very clear no. They can't. And if what you mean by angel, and I said that, and if what you mean by angel or demon is they pre-exist or they can exist independently of human agency, then then I'm not agreeing with that, right?
But did you receive a clear answer, right?
My answer is yes, they can. And again, that's why I say, and I'm with Lewis on this, that we are sort of amphibious creatures. We are both spiritual in a way that my dog is not. And so we participate with other non-human spirits that are out in existence. And I think this is basic Christianity. And to be surprised that I would say such things, again, is sort of like Rationality Rules getting a little bit surprised when Jonathan said to him quite clearly, I think Jesus walked out of the tomb.
I did. I think from Jonathan, I got a clear answer. I'm not so sure I got a clear answer from Paul.
That's why I gave it.
And I don't want to criticize people in absentia, because I want to also acknowledge, I want to put on the table that Paul and Jonathan are also trying to do other things than theory building in these discussions that are just as valuable to them as the project of theory building. And I do respect that. I'm engaged in community building and other things, and I know what that's like. And that's an important responsibility. I got a clear answer from Jonathan. Now, I'm hesitant because
Jonathan's answer was really interesting, and it was not taped because it was after my conversation with John that Jonathan sort of hit that, and there were like new ideas to me, and it's like I want to hear more about this from Jonathan, and I want to go through and find where Jonathan talked about that, because some of those ideas were really interesting.
My memory, like yours, is biased, and I'm sure it's engaging in reconstruction right now. It's been a couple of weeks, and I've been to one conference in between. But what I remember is that he basically said, no, they can't, which I thought was a really gutsy answer on his part.
I don't think that was quite John's answer or Jonathan's answer. I think Jonathan's answer basically asserted that this all runs through the Son of Man, which I thought was really an interesting answer.
And he was trying to come up with, and he was presenting an argument. He was trying to come up with this idea.
And the answer had to do with sort of a Colossians 1. See, now I'm doing my in-house thing, because when I'm referring to Colossians 1, probably John and Nathan are, and Jonathan says, I'm not a chapter verse guy, but Colossians 1 is a pretty important passage. And there's a way in which in Colossians 1, Paul says all things were made through him, both visible and invisible, that I think Jonathan made an argument that there can be nothing, it all is mediated by humanity, but I don't think it's in the same way that John and Nathan are saying in a more emergent sense that this stuff comes from us. Because I think Jonathan would say it comes down to us by not only the Logos, but the pre-incarnate Christ as foundational to the universe that we participate in. That was my understanding.
Of something like, not particular human beings, but something like humanity in general. He was invoking the medieval concept from Eastern Orthodoxy, sort of anthropos, right, as somehow the entity that was responsible for the creation of these. And so I need to know more about that, and he has promised that he and I will talk more about that. We were supposed to do a conversation about it, but we ended up talking about something else. So what I can say to you is he answered no. He realizes the problem for a sort of standard Christian metaphysics. He's trying to introduce something from the tradition that he thinks can serve as an intermediary or bridging. And so in that sense, I see him moving in response to the question. I need more from what he means by this. I've only seen one talk, and I have asked him to talk to me about it. And so that's as much as I can say. I don't know if you'd consider it, Nathan, a clear answer, but It was a responsible attempt to become clearer and more definitive, recognize the problem of the commitment to certain claims, and trying to respond to them. And I thought that was a good move on his part.
Yeah, I mean, I think you're sort of obviously treating him very, very fairly in how you're kind of analyzing his response and stuff. I think this sort of ties into what another one of my questions with respect to egregores. So, I mean, I got a clip, but I don't think it's worth playing. I think you'll trust my word for it. But again, I could be slightly wrong in the details.
I will trust your word for it. I mean,
again, egregores is not a term that any of the three of us would prefer. But what we're talking about are non-human distributed agents or spiritual entities that are not dependent or reliant on human beings.
I think you're an honest person, Nathan. I'm not getting any.
Well, I try to be.
Well, as do I. So please continue.
So it's just where in a conversation with Jonathan, where he basically says something to the effect of, and I'm really happy with your work, John, because it provides us with the scientific language with which to describe these things that the medievals were talking about, and so on, or something like that.
Yes. Yes.
And then I think from my point of view, there's something sort of troubling and worrying about that, because I think Jonathan does have a lot of harmful and false supernatural beliefs where he will attribute.
Okay, this, I think we're coming to the anxiety that Nathan really has.
Demon possession to basically people who he disagrees with politically or perhaps ethically or morally and things like that. And there's a similar, this is specifically with respect.
Because now I would assume that Nathan's larger worldview agenda, given the materialism that he self-described with, is in fact to banish all such things as superstition. And I think what he's basically coming to is the rather common atheist complaint about Jordan Peterson and now the three of us, that somehow, and I guess John Vervaeke, because John is not an atheist, he's a non-theist, and he's a physicalist, that, John, you're giving aid and comfort to these people who are the problem, and that would be the religious. Now, again, we're sort of triggering the whole atheist, Christian, YouTube space that was so hot and heavy about a decade ago, but has in fact been diminishing. And, you'll hear that from someone like Justin Brierley, who in some ways built a career on this kind of debate.
Respect to egregores and providing a scientific sounding vocabulary for essentially what I think.
And again, none of the three of us came up with egregores. Egregores is a term that has come from a different place, but again, it's sort of the language that we were given by just the way it came into us.
It should just be viewed as sort of superstitious beliefs that should be rejected from my point of view. Should.
Okay. We all get to have shoulds, but we should own them. Should.
But it would also be maybe that there's a sense of, well, yeah, we're having a really deep conversation that marries together theology and cognitive science and stuff like that. And this is something that happens with Peterson as well. But the problem is, I think, with some of these ideas that now we've provided some of these people with a scientific vocabulary, but where the rubber hits the road with these ideas.
We've provided some of these people, like Paul and Jonathan, we've given them science. Now they're going to go out and, every fifth grader out there has learned to use the science word to justify whatever they want. This isn't new to us. But again, we're back to, you're giving aid and comfort to the kind of superstitious people that should be put away and shouldn't be given a platform.
Side of having the interesting conversation at the intersection of subjects is often ideas like Christian nationalism like being anti-climate change, people making the decision to like vote for Donald Trump again in the US maybe, or not to make positive consumer.
Is he worried about who I'm going to vote for? Because I'm the only one that gets to vote in American elections. None of the rest of y'all do. Well, not you all, the audience, but John doesn't, Jonathan doesn't, Jordan doesn't, Nathan doesn't. They're helping Republicans. This is what we're going to worry about? I haven't seen any of the three of us, and again, this is a way in which we're sort of distinct from Jordan. None of the three of us have seen this at all as our primary emphasis, but here's the anxiety. And this is where really you get the worldview, and this is what I hear. I hear critics on one side of me, I hear critics on another side of me that, Paul is deviating from the party line, and the real agenda is, again, now remember that one pin I said about earlier on, sort of the agency in terms of a distributed agency? That is exactly what this is about. It's about distributed agency. If we can somehow shut up all of the people, don't let those people get together in whatever rallies or whatever conversations, or we're going to have to close the pubs, we're going to have to close the churches, we're going to have to, go to East Germany and have us all listening and make sure that nobody's having an unsupervised conversation, lest the dreaded political enemy wins.
Consumer choices that will benefit the planet because Jordan Peterson's angry about climate change and it's a political point. And I guess that so the question to you, to finally get around to it, because I realize I'm kind of rambling at that point, is just to say, do you worry that sometimes some of the people you're talking to and some of the ideas that you're talking about, maybe you're not being cautious enough about how they're being deployed by other people, which obviously
And to me, I find this to be exactly the opposite argument, but the same. It's one of these like opposite things of Christians who say, these estuary groups, how do we know that there's no heresy going on in them? I'm sure there is. You're going to close down the pubs because there's plenty of heresy going on in them. It was funny in California when they first started trying to close the churches. Well, somehow the strip joints, they had to stay open because they were providing a necessary service. But the churches, no, they should close. Babylon Bee had a heyday with that one. But again, it's sort of this anxious, we don't encourage those religious people. They might believe in old ideas, and it's our project to make sure those ideas all go away, because those ideas were the bad ideas that have hurt us. And now
you can't control what they're going to do with them, but maybe there's a responsibility there for you to be aware of how they're being used. And then if they're being used in these harmful ways, to really provide some pushback, to
harmful ways. We're using God's language in harmful ways. Well, that's because I saw in a comment that someone recently had left a comment and said, well, John by his language has helped me be a better Christian. Well, I guess that's Nathan's point, that John's language is being used in a harmful way.
To make sure that doesn't happen.
And I think that's a good question, and it's a fair question. And I do reflect on it, and I do talk to the people that I trust to give me good advice about it. I tend to treat this on a case-by-case basis. So, for example, Jordan Peterson is problematic for me. I do not, and I publicly said this many times, and to him, I do not agree with his political positions. And I do not think that people should take whatever impact they have from his insights about myth or mythology to in any way authorize conclusions he's drawing about the political situation in Canada.
Now, part of this gets into the question of, well, how do we engage people that have ideas, be they political, or maybe they have ethical behaviors that we disagree with? We deal with this all the time in church. Let me just mention John Howard Yoder. John Howard Yoder was an Anabaptist scholar that wrote a very famous book in the 1970s, The Politics of Jesus. And it was a very important book. And I don't think, actually, frankly, Nathan would be too upset by the kinds of politics that John Howard Yoder was writing about in that book. But then John Howard Yoder, it began to be disclosed that John Howard Yoder had some, at least as far as Christians go, inappropriate relationship with women. And how do you square that? Well, this is what we deal with people all the time. And by the nature that we all seem to be looking for perfect people, says something about, I think, how we deal with ideals. And so, again, you don't have to agree with Nathan's politics. You don't have to agree with John's politics. You don't have to agree with my politics. You don't have to agree with Jonathan's politics. And as I said earlier, John's politics and Jonathan's politics and my politics, first of all, we're the three of us are divided at least by a border. And even roughly speaking, if you sort of charted us on a map, you would find politically ways that John and I agree and disagree with Jonathan, ways that Jonathan and I agree and disagree with John. You're going to find that all over the place. And then here's the question, well, should Jordan Peterson talk politics? And the question of that is, it depends on what he wants to be and do. And I've talked about that plenty on my channel. But Jordan is free to talk politics. Jordan is free to have any kind of politics he wants. Part of what it means to live in Western political democracy is you get to have political ideas and you get to talk about them. And if you got a big YouTube channel, you get to promote them. It's just the way it is. You get to have theological and religious ideas, and you get to talk about them. And whether you have a small YouTube channel or a big YouTube channel, you get to talk about them. Guess what? You get to talk about them at home. You get to talk about them in the pub. You get to talk about them in the church. You get to talk about them with your friends. You get to talk about them with your mom and your dad. You get to talk about them anywhere you want to. And what we don't want is East Germany where, everything is bugged, and somehow there's sort of a supervisor with all of this. And we all also get to have the kinds of associations and modulate our associations in the way that we want to have them. This is what it means to live in a free and open society. And I'm thankful for it. And so, again, some people don't like it that I talk to Jonathan Pageau. Some people don't like it that I talk to John Vervaeke. I have different reasons. Some people don't like it that I do videos on Jordan Peterson. Some people don't like it that I do videos on Jesus. That's the way it goes. And you might not like it, and you have a right to not like it. But if that's the complaint, I don't know where you're going to go.
And I've been clear on this. You shouldn't do that. I often talk about the two Jordans, and to me, it's analogous on the left with Chomsky. Chomsky gets a lot of credence for some of his political philosophy from his authority as a linguist, and he himself admits there's no clear connection between those two discourses. But that bleed happens there, so it's not just on the right; it also happens on the left. And so I'm very careful around that. Paul and Jonathan, I take them to be, and I haven't seen some of the things you're alluding to about for Jonathan, so I'll just have to respond from what I.
Jonathan is a deeply conservative guy. He joined the Orthodox Church. I mean, it amazes me that people are surprised by the kinds of ideas that Jonathan would have. But then Jonathan isn't sort of the stuff gets so nuanced. And again, this isn't the focus of my channel, but
seen and interacted. For them, I feel that there is an effort, and there's going to be mistakes and there's going to be some sloppiness, but I feel like it's the effort, parallel in the Middle Ages to somebody like Aquinas or Augustine at the end of antiquity, trying to take the philosophical tradition and the religious traditions and marry them together. And that's That's a weird process. It's not straight deduction. It's not straight it's not straight induction. It has some abductive elements in it to it, but there's also the creation of new terms, new concepts. That's why I often use the term that Carey used for talking about Augustine in his book, this Latin term inventio, that it's doing both of these at the same time. And I see, and just to be clear, both Jonathan and Paul were talking about this at the Thunder Bay conference, that they feel that there's something big happening, and they were even proposing the idea that Christianity may be going through a transformation as radical as that of around the time of Augustine or Aquinas.
I think it's probably a little bit easier for me to say that as a Protestant than for Jonathan as Orthodox. But no, I agree with that. I think Christianity is, it's so difficult because part of the genius of Christianity is there is a genius in Christianity within its fragmentation. And the continual existence and, in some ways, vitality of the Orthodox Church is, in fact, an element of that, as is true in the Roman Catholic Church, as is true in certain little pockets and elements of the Protestant Church, that certain things are preserved even past the zeitgeist, the spirit of the age, and go into the future. And so there's not only sort of a written record of past belief, but there are still manifestations and living communities that express the relationship between the present and the past in their communities, always idiosyncratically, always with different nuances. But that, I think, is part of the genius of the church and part of the genius of Christianity, and what makes Christianity such a vital religion. Now, I remember one author talking about the fact that towards the end of World War I, a lot of people wondered if Islam itself would collapse. And then, of course, there was resurgent Islamism. There is, in fact, sort of a resurgent Hinduism going on today. And there's, of course, a form of Buddhism that is in the West that I think is distinct probably from Buddhism in the East. And so this is a normal function of religion. But I do believe that I wouldn't be engaged with Jonathan and John and paying attention to Jordan and how many other people that I pay attention to if I didn't believe that it was vitally important for Christians to be conversant with the other conversations going on in the world today. That's what we're doing. Now, if you're a secular materialist who has a particular political stance that you have sort of stereotyped the church into somehow this regressive element that is mean to women and gays and I don't know what other people you think the church is mean towards, and the church should be abolished. Well, you get to have that political posture. Maybe you do, maybe you don't. I don't know. I don't want to straw man Nathan in this, but what I hear coming from him, his chief complaint, I think, is this political anxiety. And again, I find this mirrored on other sides, sometimes by people in the church, also forced at me that, Paul isn't conservative enough. Paul isn't outspoken enough on issues about gays or abortion or how many other issues that are salient to different people in the church. This is natural when you're living in sort of a battleground and a battlefield like this. And part of what I think the church actually prepares you for is to live in a culture war, because to one degree or another, culture wars are always alive and well in the church. That was certainly true of the first century in which Paul was working and writing, and it is certainly true today. And I think a good reading of church history shows it has been true all the way through. What I'm not going to do is start to get anxious about people's ability to do what I think we all have to do and need to do, which is think and speak and use language and talk and dialogue and dialogos. Because I think we're living in an age that is full of change. Now, I don't know if I'm going to be able to get through this whole thing in the time that I have, but I think I've covered most of the issues that I have in terms of, I know Nathan was very frustrated that I'm not engaging with his criticism. And so part of the purpose of this video is to engage with his criticism. Now, I did so in a previous video where you're not doing it right and the political anxiety. And again, these are, I think, his two main objections. And I think I have explained the siloing of disciplines. I understand the inside outside, and I went quite a bit of that earlier in this video, and so that was dealt with it. But this other thing is, in fact, sort of the main broad criticism that sort of is put against people who won't stay in their lane. So, Paul, you're a Christian pastor. You shouldn't talk to a non-theist. Paul, you're a Reformed pastor. You shouldn't talk to an icon carver. This kind of argument that somehow I'm giving aid and comfort to iconography and cognitive science, I am simply not going to abide with. I'm not going to do it because I don't see politics as the primary concern. Politics is now, religion is always. My concern is much more religious. But even then, I'm not going to be a conversational fuss budget and worry that people are talking in an unsupervised way. Not going to do it. I don't do it in my church. I'm not going to do it with Estuary. Now, atheists might, I can understand atheist anxiety about it in a way better than I can understand Christian anxiety about it. Because atheist anxiety about it means that everything is just stuck down here at this level and the future is simply a function of the conversation and the politics and the sociology and all of that. I'm a Christian. I think the future is a function of the providence of God and the power of the Holy Spirit to do the work that he intends to do. So I'm not anxious. Now, if I were an atheist, maybe I'd be more anxious. And I think this gets into the idea that if I were an atheist, I would probably have, in increasing measure, my politics be my religion. But part of the reason I think having a vivid religious life can, not always, because there's plenty of Christians who seem to have their politics as their religion, I will grant you that. But part of this is my religion is primary. One of the first videos on this channel I said, and I've said a lot here, so I don't hold anyone, to account to have heard everything I've said. But one of the things that I said right away is I'm a religious believer and a political skeptic. I don't put my eggs in the political bag. I'm a religious person. And you might not like that about me, and you might decide not to listen to any of my videos because I am a religious person. But I thank God for people like John Vervaeke, who, on one hand, is tremendously knowledgeable about my religion and other religions, and he takes it seriously as a function of human reality. And it astounds me the enormous blind side of how many journalistic enterprises and academic enterprises that don't take religion seriously when it's so obviously such a huge and fundamental aspect of human life in the world continually. So I think that's probably enough on this. If Nathan wants to talk, I'll be happy to talk with him, but this anxiety about the religious people are the ones who are not believing in climate change and the ones who are being mean to certain classes of people. There's some degree of truth to that, but the way to address it is to say, well, we have to get rid of religion. That new atheist card has been tried and it's going nowhere. And in fact, it's going to continue to go nowhere. And it's certainly, in terms of a global perspective, not going anywhere, given the fact that Asia and Africa are increasingly coming under the sway of the major world religions. And what we see in places where major world religions have sort of receded is, in fact, a lot of other chaos where, it used to be that before COVID, the anti-vaxxers weren't for the most part religious. They were soccer moms and rather atheist aspects of some affluent places like in Marin County, California. So I think, again, look at the work of Clay Rutledge, and who is himself an atheist, who has basically made the point that the new atheist posture with respect to, if we can only shut down all of this superstition, then people will be, it just doesn't hold any water. And for that reason, a lot of the air has gone out of this sort of facile atheist Christian debates and the way that it was, because many people have come to recognize that, well, part of it was certainly the breakdown of the Church of Atheism with Atheism Plus versus some of the stakeholders of atheism, such as Richard Dawkins and Sam Harris, and the fact that what we see in the world is that religious type behavior is not simply a function of what in secularity has been tagged as religious belief. It's much more a function of how human beings operate. So, yeah, I think that'll do for this. We'll see where this goes, but I know Nathan wanted to be heard, and so by doing it this way, I've certainly heard him, and I think I've listened to his critiques. I think John was exactly the right person to answer his critiques, far more better than I am, because I think in a lot of ways his, even though he's anxious about the religious beliefs of Jonathan and myself, you're maybe just going to have to write us off as religious kooks. Now, maybe you do that, maybe you don't. It's fine either way. I will continue to be the person that I am, and I'll continue probably to annoy both Christians and non-Christians with a bunch of the things I do. So, and I have other Christians and non-Christians who enjoy the things I do. So I'm not defensive about it, but I think these have been the critiques, and that's my answer to them.